Eleanor Hartwell had spent 40 years learning how to disappear into a room. Not the kind of disappearing that comes from shyness or insecurity, but the practiced, deliberate vanishing act of a woman who understood that her value in any given space depended on how little attention she drew to herself. She could set a table for 20, manage a dinner party for Boston's most prominent legal families, redirect a conversation that was turning unpleasant, and refill a glass before the guest even noticed. It was empty, all without anyone remembering she had been there at all. She had perfected this art over 4 decades, and on the morning of March 25th, 2024, standing in front of the bathroom mirror of the Chestnut Hill house she had lived in since 1984, she wondered if she had perfected it so completely that she had finally disappeared from her own life. She was wearing the black dress Walter had always preferred for formal occasions. Simple cut, no ornamentation, the kind of dress that communicated appropriate grief without demanding sympathy. Her white hair was pinned the way he liked, pulled back cleanly from her face. She looked, she thought, exactly like what she was supposed to look like on the morning her husband's will was to be read. Composed, dignified, appropriately widowed. The thought arrived without warmth. She picked up her pearl earrings from the edge of the sink and pressed them into place, and the woman in the mirror pressed them in too, and neither of them looked particularly afraid. She had found Walter on the morning of March 12, 2 weeks earlier. The ritual had been unchanged for 40 years. She woke at 6:30, made his coffee the way he took it, black with a single spoonful of sugar, and carried it upstairs to the bedroom, where he would be sitting up by then reading the Globe on his tablet, glasses low on his nose. That morning, the bedroom door had been slightly open, which was unusual, and the room beyond it was too quiet in a way she felt before she understood it. He was lying on his side, facing the window, the covers pulled neatly to his shoulder, as though he had simply decided somewhere in the territory between sleep and morning that he was finished. The coffee cup was still in her hand when the doctor arrived. She did not remember calling anyone. The grief that followed was not the grief she had expected. She had imagined in the abstract way people imagine things they believe are still far away, that losing Walter would feel like losing the ground beneath her feet. Instead, it felt like losing her compass in a place she had never really learned to navigate without it. She was not devastated. She was disoriented. And beneath the disorientation, in a place she did not examine closely for the first several days, there was something she could only describe as a held breath, the sense of waiting for something she did not yet have a name for. The formal letter from James Whitfield's office arrived on March 18th, 6 days after Walter's death, delivered by a courier who required her signature. Inside was a single typed page on firm letterhead informing her that the reading of Walter Hartwell's last will and testament was scheduled for March 25th at 10 in the morning, and that her presence was requested. That was all. No personal note. No word of condolence from the man who had been to her dinner table 14 times in the last decade. She put the letter on the kitchen counter and made herself a cup of tea and stood at the window looking out at the garden for a long time without thinking about anything at all. The garden had been her one true project in 40 years at the Chestnut Hill house. Walter had the house when she married him. A large colonial on a quiet street. 4 bedrooms, 2 formal reception rooms, a kitchen. She had gradually transformed over the years into something functional and warm, and a backyard that had been when she arrived. A flat expanse of lawn with 2 untended beds along the fence. She had built it into something else entirely. Over the decades, roses organized by season along the southern wall. A cutting garden she replanted each spring. Perennial beds designed to bloom in sequence from the first crocuses in March through the last chrysanthemums in November. She knew every plant by name and by temperament. She knew which roses sulked after a wet June and which thrived on neglect. The garden was the one space in the house that had never belonged to anyone but her. And standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the frost-browned remains of the season's last blooms, she felt its particular silence as something close to company. The night before the will reading, she found the note. She had been going through the items on Walter's nightstand. a task she had been avoiding for days, the small archaeology of a man's final bedside accumulation, when she found it folded under the base of his reading lamp. A single square of his monogrammed notepaper, the heavy cream stock he used for personal correspondence, folded twice. Her name on the outside in his precise architectural handwriting. She sat down on the edge of the bed and unfolded it. "Trust me one last time. I am sorry for everything that is about to happen tomorrow. Please go to Millhaven as soon as you can. Do not wait." She read it 3 times. Then she sat in the dark of the bedroom for a long time, holding the paper in both hands, trying to understand what she was supposed to feel. The phrasing implied that he understood she might, after tomorrow, find that trust more difficult to extend. She folded the note carefully and put it in the inside pocket of her purse, and did not sleep until well after 2 in the morning. She had met Walter Hartwell in the spring of 1983 when she was 27 years old, and working as a legal assistant at the downtown Boston firm where he was a senior partner. She had been there 3 years by then, had worked her way from receptionist to the position with the kind of quiet competence that rarely gets celebrated, but frequently gets relied upon. She could draft a brief, manage a filing deadline, organize a discovery process, and anticipate what a partner needed before he asked for it. She had done 2 years of pre-law at UMass Boston before her mother's illness had required her to come home and work full-time, and though she never completed the degree, she understood the architecture of legal argument in a way that made her genuinely useful rather than merely efficient. Walter had noticed this. He was 43, then recently widowed, with 3 children in their late teens, who regarded his professional life with the proud disinterest of children who have always had enough money to take their father's success for granted. He was impressive in the way that certain men are impressive, not through force of personality, but through a kind of gravitational calm, the sense that he occupied whatever room he entered more completely than anyone else. Their first dinner had been in October 1983 at a restaurant in the Back Bay that Eleanor had never been able to afford on her own salary. He had asked her carefully, almost formally, as though conscious of the professional complications and unwilling to treat them as though they did not exist. She had said yes with the same clarity. 6 months later, on a Saturday morning in April 1984, he had proposed in the kitchen of the Chestnut Hill house, standing at the counter with 2 cups of coffee, saying simply that he would like her to stay. She had said yes to that too, with the same uncomplicated certainty, and she had genuinely believed with the full weight of herself that she understood what she was agreeing to. What she had not understood, and what would take her approximately 6 months to begin to grasp, was that marrying Walter Hartwell meant marrying his children's resentment as a permanent third party in the union. Conrad had been 23 when she married his father, already a year into law school at BU, already wearing the particular expression he would maintain for the next 40 years, a controlled pleasantness that communicated to anyone paying close attention that he considered the person he was looking at to be a temporary inconvenience. He was intelligent. She had never underestimated that. And he had inherited his father's precision with language, though not his father's underlying warmth. What Conrad lacked, and what he had compensated for his entire adult life by accumulating credentials and property and professional standing, was his father's capacity for genuine feeling. Diana had been 21 at the wedding, already beautiful in the slightly brittle way that becomes more brittle with time, and already expert at the particular female art of cruelty, delivered with perfect plausible deniability. "Do not even try to be our mother," she had said at the reception, her voice sweet, her smile intact, her eyes doing the actual work of the sentence. Eleanor had not tried to be their mother. She had tried instead to be something more useful and less threatening, a consistent, reliable presence in their father's house who remembered their preferences and never made demands on their loyalty. This approach had failed completely, as approaches built entirely on accommodation tend to fail because people who want to resent you will find a way to resent you, regardless of your behavior. Brett had been 16 at the wedding, the youngest and the most visibly confused by the whole arrangement. She had felt in those early years something close to genuine fondness for him, a gangly, uncertain boy who clearly missed his mother and had no vocabulary for the missing. She had tried carefully to make room for that without overstepping. Then Conrad and Diana had decided that Brett's ambivalence about Eleanor was disloyalty to the family, and Brett, who had never had the spine to contradict either of his older siblings about anything that mattered, had fallen into line. She had not held it against him entirely. She had over the years developed the habit of holding her assessments of Brett slightly looser than her assessments of the others, leaving room for the possibility that he was not entirely what his siblings had made him. The 40 years of the marriage had been in the way of most long marriages, not one thing, but many. There had been good years, the mid-90s, when Walter's practice was at its height, and the children were adults making their own lives elsewhere, and the Chestnut Hill house had felt for the first time actually like her home. Winters in front of the fireplace with books and wine. Summers on the Cape. The year Walter had surprised her with a trip to Napa for their 15th anniversary, and she had understood for the first time that he was trying in his contained and often inarticulate way to show her something he could not quite say directly. There had been bad years too, the slow grinding difficulty of Conrad's first attempt to challenge Walter's estate planning in 2003, which had revealed to Eleanor with unpleasant clarity exactly how far Conrad was willing to go to protect what he considered his inheritance. The year Walter had the heart attack, and she had sat beside his hospital bed for 4 days, and he had held her hand and said he was not afraid of dying, only afraid of not being there when she needed him. And she had realized she had no idea whether this was the truest thing he had ever said to her, or a version of truth edited for crisis. She had asked once about the monthly trips. This was in 1991, 7 years into the marriage, after the trips had been happening long enough that their regularity had become its own kind of explanation. He had told her he had inherited a property from a distant uncle, a small place in a rural town west of Boston, and that he used it to decompress from the demands of practice. She had accepted this. She had accepted it because she trusted him, and because she had learned in 7 years of marriage that there were territories in Walter Hartwell that operated on a different logic than the rest of him, and that pressing into those territories rarely produced anything useful. She had not asked again. She had not thought about it much actually in the years that followed. The trips were so regular, they became part of the background texture of the marriage, as unremarkable as his Saturday morning runs or his habit of reading case files in bed until midnight. She packed his bag. She kissed him goodbye. She spent the weekend in the garden or with a book, and felt honestly something close to contentment in his absence, not because she wanted him gone, but because solitude was something she had learned to use well. On the morning of March 25th, she drove herself downtown, parked in the garage on Tremont, and took the elevator to the 14th floor of the building, where Whitfield and Associates occupied a corner suite with views of the common. The receptionist brought her coffee and told her the others were already in the conference room. She carried her cup down the hall, pushed open the door, and found Conrad, Diana, and Brett arranged on one side of the long mahogany table, like a panel convened for a judgment. Their spouses had not been invited, but their lawyers had, and 3 additional people she did not recognize sat along the wall with legal pads. Conrad was in a suit that had cost more than her car. Diana was wearing black in the specific way that communicated she intended to be the most visibly bereaved person in the room. Brett was looking at his phone. James Whitfield came in 2 minutes later. A tall man in his mid-60s with the careful demeanor of someone who has spent 40 years delivering information people do not want to hear. He had been to the Chestnut Hill house for dinner many times. He set his briefcase on the table and did not make eye contact with Eleanor directly as he opened it, and she recognized in this careful avoidance the behavior of a man who knows something difficult is coming and is managing his own discomfort about delivering it. He opened with the standard language testamentary capacity, proper execution. The legal weight of the document before him, and Eleanor listened with her hands folded on the table in front of her, and felt underneath the formal surface of the proceedings the held breath she had been carrying since Walter died, beginning to tighten into something else. The estate was valued at $9.2 million. Whitfield noted clearly and immediately that this figure represented the gross appraised value prior to any deduction for outstanding financial obligations. Conrad's pen stopped moving for a half second at this. Diana did not react. The itemization that followed was methodical. The Chestnut Hill residence currently appraised at $2.3 million to be divided equally among Conrad, Diana, and Brett Hartwell. Investment accounts totaling approximately $4.8 million, same distribution. Retirement accounts of approximately $1.9 million, same distribution. Various personal property artwork, and professional library to be divided at the discretion of the three heirs. Eleanor sat very still through all of this. She watched Conrad allow himself a small controlled nod at each line item, the nod of a man confirming that reality has aligned with his expectations. She watched Diana study the cuticle of her left index finger with the performance of someone who wants to appear unaffected by news she already knew. She watched Brett put his phone face down on the table and look at the window. Then Whitfield reached a name in the document, and his voice underwent a slight, almost imperceptible change. A controlled flatness that she recognized as professional restraint, applied against something he personally found distasteful. And he read Walter's words in Walter's legal cadence, delivered by Walter's attorney, that Eleanor Ann Hartwell had lived comfortably at his expense for 40 years and had wanted for nothing during the course of their marriage, that she had benefited from his wealth, his home, his social standing, and a lifestyle beyond what she could have achieved independently, that this constituted in his considered judgment more than adequate compensation for her companionship and for the domestic services she had provided over the years of their union, that his primary obligation and responsibility lay with his children and his bloodline, that they were his true legacy. The word companionship landed somewhere in Eleanor's sternum and stayed there. Domestic services arrived just behind it. She did not move. She did not change her expression. She had spent 40 years practicing the art of absorbing things in public without reacting to them. And the training held, though she could feel beneath the controlled surface something fundamental shifting, not collapsing, but rearranging itself into a new configuration that she did not yet have words for. Conrad received the news of his inheritance with the nod of a man collecting a debt. Diana's eyes moved briefly to Eleanor's face with an expression that had been calibrated to look like sympathy and landed in the fluorescent light of the conference room as something considerably colder. Brett was still looking at the window. Eleanor received one property located at 12 Stonewood Ridge in the town of Millhaven, Massachusetts, along with all contents therein. She was to vacate the Chestnut Hill residence within 30 days. Whitfield slid a brown envelope across the table. His hand was not entirely steady. Inside, he said quietly, was the deed to the Millhaven property now transferred to her name a key and a handwritten note from Walter that he had asked to be included. Diana's voice was the first to fill the silence, arriving at the precise pitch of concern it would need to be to function as its opposite. Daddy mentioned Millhaven once, she said. He said it was an old house essentially falling apart in the middle of nowhere, not worth the bother of selling. A pause that was timed. At least you will have a roof over your head. Conrad was already moving on to practical considerations, which was his preferred mode in any situation that might otherwise require him to feel something. He wanted to discuss the timeline for vacating the residence. He mentioned the real estate market. He said the word staging with the ease of a man who had been thinking about staging a house while his stepmother was still living in it. Whitfield told him firmly that Eleanor was legally entitled to 30 full days and that this was non-negotiable. Conrad agreed with the graciousness of someone who intends to make those 30 days as unpleasant as possible. Eleanor opened the brown envelope. The key was iron-old, its surface mottled in a way that suggested long disuse, though she noticed in the particular light from the conference room windows that the mottling was not quite uniform. Some patches caught the light differently than others. She turned it in her fingers once and then put it in her coat pocket. The handwritten note was on Walter's personal stationery, his precise handwriting covering half a page. 12, Stonewood Ridge, Millhaven, Massachusetts. Ellie, this is yours now. Go there as soon as you can. You will understand everything once you arrive. I'm sorry I could not tell you before. They were always watching, always looking for ways to challenge anything I tried to do. Trust me one last time, my darling. All my love always. She folded the letter back into the envelope and stood. She did not say anything to Conrad or Diana or Brett. She picked up her purse and walked to the door, and she heard Whitfield stand as she reached it. Heard the brief scrape of his chair, and then felt him move to a position close enough to say quietly, "Go to Millhaven as soon as you can. Please do not wait too long." She nodded without turning and pushed through the door into the carpeted hallway beyond. In the elevator going down, she took the key out of her coat pocket and held it under the thin fluorescent light in the elevator ceiling. The mottled surface that had looked like rust in the conference room was something else entirely under better light, a deliberate application of something dark and granular painted on to create the appearance of age and neglect. The underlying metal was clean. Someone had designed this object to look worthless to the wrong people. The 30 days that followed were a tutorial in a specific variety of cruelty that Eleanor had always known Conrad and Diana were capable of, but had hoped until now she would not have to experience in its full expression. They came to the Chestnut Hill house almost every day, not announcing themselves, simply arriving with contractors and interior designers and real estate agents, as though the house had already been vacated and they were working in an empty space. She was present for all of it, sitting at the kitchen table when a contractor measured the doorway standing in the upstairs hall, when Diana and an interior designer discussed eliminating the wall between the master bedroom and the smaller room beside it. They moved around her with the practiced indifference of people who have decided that someone does not exist, and the deliberateness of the decision was worse in some ways than open hostility would have been. A real estate agent came on the 9th day and walked through the house while Eleanor was reading in the living room armchair. He stood 3 feet from her chair and discussed the staging potential of the space with Conrad, as though the chair and its occupant were part of the same inventory. He noted that the garden was significantly overgrown and would require professional landscaping before listing. The garden that she had built bed by bed over 40 years, that she had been tending since before this agent was born, that contained species she had propagated herself from cuttings and divisions, reduced to a staging liability in a sentence delivered to a man who had never once walked its paths. On the 14th day, Brett came alone. This
It's
was
so
unusual enough that
lovely
she
out
noticed it
here.
immediately.
It really is
He
so
appeared in the
peaceful,
kitchen doorway while
just
she
like
was
old
washing the
times.
breakfast dishes, and he stood there for what felt like a full minute watching her. She did not turn around. She heard him open his mouth, a small intake of breath, the kind that precedes a sentence. Then his phone buzzed in his pocket. He looked at the screen. The sentence, whatever it had been, dissolved. He left without speaking. She stood at the sink for a while after he had gone, hands still in the water, considering what he had almost said, and why it had mattered enough to bring him here alone, and why it had not been enough to survive a single phone call from Diana. The nights were their own territory. She would lie in the master bedroom, and her mind would move through the arithmetic of her situation with the relentless precision of a machine that cannot be turned off. She was 68 years old. Her most recent employment as a legal assistant had ended in 1984, 40 years ago. The skills she had developed over those 4 decades, running a household, managing social obligations, anticipating needs, maintaining the complex invisible infrastructure of a prominent man's domestic life, were not skills that appeared on resumes or translated into salaries. On the worst nights, the fear would become physical, a tightening in her chest, a shortness of breath, a heart rate she could feel in her fingertips. She would get up and pace the dark bedroom, and understand viscerally and without the buffer of abstraction. What it meant to be 68 years old and alone and financially dependent on a property she had never seen in a town she had never visited. Then the fear would exhaust itself and become something harder and quieter. How dare he? Not shouted, not even thought loudly. Just present a cold specific fury at the man who had let her believe for 40 years that they were building something together, that she was not merely useful but genuinely part of the enterprise. Who had looked at her from a hospital bed and told her he was afraid of not being there when she needed him, and had apparently been building the machinery of her abandonment during every monthly trip to a town he had never once mentioned to her by name. On the 28th morning, she was clearing the kitchen drawers when her hand closed around something in the back of the utility drawer. A photograph. Small square, the distinctive border of a Polaroid print. She turned it over. Walter was standing in front of a stone house she had never seen. He was younger, mid-40s, which meant this had been taken around the time they were married. And he was smiling in a way she had seen perhaps a dozen times in 40 years. Unguarded, unperformed, his whole face arranged around something that was simply true. He was wearing a flannel shirt and old work boots, and he looked nothing like the senior partner of one of Boston's most prominent law firms. On the back of the photograph in his handwriting, Millhaven, June 1984. The place I actually live. June 1984. 3 months after their wedding. She stood in the kitchen holding the photograph and understood that she had just found the edge of something much larger than she had been looking at. The morning of April 12th arrived with the particular blankness of days that have been dreaded long enough to lose their ability to surprise. She had packed carefully 3 suitcases of clothing, 2 boxes of genuinely personal items, photographs from her life before Walter. Letters her mother had written her over the years, her grandmother's copy of a beloved novel with the pencil annotations still in the margins. The wedding photograph from the living room mantel. Conrad had objected technically a house asset, he had said technically part of the estate inventory. She had looked at him with a directness she had been conserving for 40 years and said, "Take me to court," and put it in her bag. He was standing in the front hall when she came down with her last load, watching the staircase with the practiced patience of a man who has already decided this situation is beneath his dignity, but is willing to wait it out. She set down the bag and looked at him. "Conrad, when your father was dying, when he was in that room at 5 in the morning, and the house was completely quiet, the first thing he asked for was me. Not you, not Diana, not Brett." She picked up her bag. "I think you should spend some time with that fact." She did not wait for his response. She walked out the front door and down the steps and put her bags in the trunk of a 10-year-old Honda Civic without looking back at the house. The brown envelope was on the passenger seat. She had checked it again that morning, going through its contents with the deliberateness of someone taking inventory before a journey. The deed, the key, the note from Walter, and the 4th item, the one Whitfield had not mentioned aloud at the reading. A small square of paper folded into quarters, tucked beneath the key. "Ask for Ruth Calloway before you go inside. She knows everything." Eleanor entered the address into her phone's navigation and pulled out of the driveway and drove west out of Chestnut Hill toward a town she had never heard of, with a key that someone had painted to look broken, and the held breath of 40 years finally slowly beginning to release. The drive west took 2 hours and 14 minutes, and Eleanor spent most of it in the specific silence of someone who has stopped trying to prepare themselves for something unknown. The highway gave way to state roads. The state roads to 2-lane county routes that move through small towns with gas stations and churches, and the particular settled quiet of places that have not changed their essential character in 50 years. The landscape outside her windows shifted from suburban density to open farmland, to the beginnings of second-growth forest, and she let it pass without commentary, her hands steady on the wheel. The town of Millhaven appeared without announcement. No billboard, no welcome sign, just a gradual condensing of structures along the roadside that became within half a mile a proper main street. It was smaller than she had imagined, and more coherent 15 or so buildings arranged around a modest central square, with a war memorial at its center, a white clapboard church on the north end, a library that looked like it had been built during the Grant administration, a general store with a painted wooden sign above its door, a diner with checkered curtains in its windows. The buildings were well maintained in the way that things are maintained in towns that have learned to take care of what they have, because replacement is not an option. What she did not expect was the attention. She was driving slowly following the navigation's instructions, and she became aware within the first block that people were stopping to watch her car pass. Not with the suspicious alertness of a small community clocking a stranger, but with something more specific. A kind of recognition that had no basis she could understand, a readiness in their posture that preceded any reasonable explanation. An elderly man sweeping the sidewalk in front of the general store paused mid-stroke and lifted his hand in a small, deliberate wave. A woman arranging flowers in buckets outside the diner turned and looked directly at Eleanor's car with an expression of quiet confirmation, as though checking something off a list. She pulled into the gas station because she needed to verify the address, and because the attention had unsettled her enough that she wanted a reason to stop and collect herself. The man working the pump was in his early 70s, wearing a canvas jacket with the station's name stenciled on the breast. She rolled down her window and read him the address from the note. He listened, and then he was quiet for exactly 1 beat too long before he looked at her directly. "You are Walter's wife," not a question. The absolute certainty of someone confirming a fact they have been holding ready. She said she was. He gave her directions with the ease of a man who has given them before or expected to give them. Ruth Calloway was standing in front of the general store with a wicker basket covered with a blue-checked cloth. She was perhaps 65, compact and unhurried, with the kind of face that has settled into its own weathering without apology. She was clearly waiting, not browsing, not passing time, waiting with the orientation of a person who has been told approximately when to expect something and is ready. Eleanor pulled to the curb and got out of the car, and Ruth looked at her with the same unnerving recognition. "Walter said you took your coffee black with 1 sugar and that you could not stand white bread. I have got the right kind." She held up the basket. "I figured you would need provisions. The house is stocked for the long term, but there is no fresh food." Eleanor stood on the sidewalk in the April chill and understood that this woman knew things about her that required years of specific attention to know, not the broad outlines of a person, but the granular details that accumulate only through consistent, caring observation. Walter had been describing her to this woman for years, in enough detail that Ruth Calloway knew her coffee order and her preferences about bread, and was standing on a sidewalk in a town Eleanor had never visited, basket in hand, waiting to help her arrive. The road to Stonewood Ridge was unpaved from a certain point, rutted with old tire tracks, lined on both sides by oaks that had been growing for what looked like centuries, trunks 4 feet across canopies that reached toward each other overhead, and created in the filtered afternoon light the impression of moving through something deliberate and protective, rather than simply through trees. At the end of the road, the oaks opened into a clearing, and Eleanor stopped the car and sat for a moment with the engine running, looking at what was in front of her. The house was fieldstone gray and deep-set 2 stories with a steep slate roof that showed no visible deterioration. The stone itself had the particular color of something very old that has been kept rather than simply left. White painted wooden trim around leaded glass windows, a covered entry with carved supports, ivy growing up the eastern wall in patterns that suggested intention rather than encroachment. The grounds around the house were overgrown in the way that formal gardens become overgrown when they are maintained at a minimal level, but not actively tended. She could see the bones of the original design in the placement of the stone pathways, the organized geometry of the beds even under their wild growth. The rose canes that had escaped their original forms, but were unmistakably roses she recognized. Heritage varieties, things that took years and specific knowledge to establish. Someone had planted this garden, with the same understanding she brought to her own. Ruth explained what Eleanor had already begun to suspect: the house had been maintained through a man named Thomas Graves, who had worked the property for the past 5 years at Walter's instruction, paid through a standing account at the local bank. Not magic, not neglect transformed by sentiment, a plan executed over time by a man who knew what he intended to leave and had arranged the infrastructure accordingly. The iron key turned in the lock without effort, and the door opened onto the interior, and Eleanor stepped across the threshold and felt the floor of her understanding shift in a way that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with the sudden overwhelming evidence of being known. The photographs were everywhere. Not in the way that photographs are distributed in a lived-in house decoratively occasionally as punctuation among other objects. These covered the walls with the density of a curated collection, every available surface contributing to a single sustained subject. Eleanor herself across 40 years in every kind of light. Eleanor in the garden of the Chestnut Hill house, kneeling in the soil with her hands dark with earth, and an expression of complete absorption on her face. Eleanor laughing at something off camera, her head thrown back unguarded in the specific way people are unguarded when they do not know they are being seen. Eleanor reading in a chair with afternoon light coming through a window behind her. The book held close, her whole body arranged around the fact of a story. Eleanor, at various ages in various seasons in ordinary moments, that someone had considered worth preserving. Ruth explained it quietly. Standing near the door, Walter had enlisted a retired photographer named George Alderman, a man who had known Walter since law school and understood what was being asked of him to document Eleanor across the years. Some photographs Walter had taken himself. All of them had been chosen and framed and arranged by a man who was building over decades a private record of what he loved most. This was not the act of a man who considered his wife adequately compensated domestic help. This was the act of a man who had been watching his wife with sustained, specific, devoted attention for 40 years and had nowhere to put it except here in the house he came to alone once a month, in the rooms where the watching did not have to be hidden. Upstairs, she found the master bedroom and stopped in the doorway. The room faced west with windows looking out over the clearing and the edge of the forest beyond, and the afternoon light came through at an angle that turned the wide plank floors amber. There were more photographs here arranged on the wall beside the window, and on the bedside table a journal. She crossed the room and picked it up. The cover was brown leather, soft, with handling her own name written inside the front cover, in her own handwriting, from 1984, the slanted, slightly rushed script of a 28-year-old who had not yet learned to slow down. She stood beside the bed and opened it to a page at random and read her own words from a September afternoon in 1984, 3 months after her wedding, written in the small bedroom of the Chestnut Hill house while Walter was at a conference in Hartford. The girl who had written those pages was trying with the particular earnestness of someone who does not yet know what they do not know to understand what she had married into. She was trying to be fair to Conrad and Diana. She was trying to believe that their coldness was grief still processing itself and that time would soften it. She was trying to build something in the space Walter had made available to her. And she was honest with herself in those pages about how uncertain she was of the blueprints. "I hope Walter is enough," she had written. "I think he is. I need him to be." Eleanor sat down on the edge of the bed with the journal in her hands, and the 40 years between the girl who had written those words and the woman reading them collapsed into something without distance. She had been right to hope and wrong to be certain, and the marriage had been both what she had feared and more than she had known. And the evidence of that more was on every wall of this house, in every room, in the deliberate, loving accumulation of a man who had failed her in the ways that were visible and had loved her in the ways he thought she would never see. She was crying before she understood she had started. Not the controlled, swallowed grief she had maintained through the funeral and the will reading and 30 days of systematic erasure. This was different. The release of something that had been held under pressure for longer than she had realized, breaking through the surface, now that the surface had finally given her permission. She let it happen. Ruth had gone back downstairs, giving her the room understanding without being told. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed in the house her husband had built for her in secret and cried for the girl who had written those pages, and for the marriage that had been, and for the marriage she had believed she was in, and for the man who had apparently known the difference and had been trying in his constrained and oblique way to build a bridge between them for 40 years and had only managed to finish it after he died. When she came back downstairs, Ruth was in the kitchen making tea. Eleanor stood in the doorway of the small room under the staircase. 3 walls of built-in shelves meticulously organized every binder and folder labeled in Walter's handwriting. The 4th wall, a mahogany desk, a banker's lamp with a green glass shade, a leather chair worn to the specific contours of a man who had sat in it many times. And on the desk surface, positioned with clear, deliberate intent, a thick, cream-colored envelope with her name on it in Walter's script. She sat in his chair and broke the wax seal and read. Walter had been expecting her questions, which was its own kind of intimacy. The intimacy of a man who knows the mind of the person he is writing to well enough to answer what has not been asked yet. He addressed the deed first. The property had been transferred to her name in September 1984, structured as a direct gift from his Uncle Thomas, to Eleanor, specifically independent of any marital asset, legally insulated from the category of property that could be challenged as jointly held. James Whitfield had been the architect of this arrangement and had maintained its confidentiality for 40 years, compensated annually for this service. The mechanism was clean and had been reviewed and reinforced 3 times over the decades by attorneys working independently, each of whom knew only their piece of the structure and not the whole. Then he explained why the structure had to be so careful. In 1987, 3 years into the marriage, Walter had retained an independent estate attorney to establish an irrevocable trust that would have provided for Eleanor directly and substantially. Conrad, then 26 and completing his first year of practice at a competing firm, had learned of this attempt through a source Walter never fully identified. He had made it unambiguously clear through a private conversation Walter described with the economy of someone still managing their anger at the memory that any such trust would be challenged immediately and publicly, and that the challenge would include an argument that Walter's judgment had been compromised by his relationship with a much younger woman of limited background who had positioned herself advantageously. Walter had understood with the cold clarity of a man who had spent 30 years in litigation that Conrad had both the standing and the determination to make such a challenge extraordinarily damaging to Walter's reputation, to his practice, to the name he had spent a career building. He had backed down. He had spent the following 3 decades finding a different architecture, building it piece by piece, in ways that Conrad could not see, and he had never forgiven himself for the backing down. The property sits on 247 acres, he had written. The last independent assessment conducted in 2022 by a conservation land trust operating out of Amherst placed the value at approximately $3.2 million. There are 3 organizations that have expressed written interest in acquisition. The decision to sell, retain, or develop is entirely and exclusively yours. The house itself was separately assessed at $800,000 as a historical structure. The trust fund, covering utilities, taxes, maintenance, and insurance, is funded for 50 years and requires nothing from you to continue operating. In the filing cabinets along the wall, you will find 40 years of documented information about powerful families collected by a man who understood that information is the most durable form of protection available. I never used any of it. Using it would have been a betrayal of the professional obligations I held for 50 years. But I kept it because I understood, even when I was too weak to act on that understanding in other ways, that you might need it. It is yours to use as you judge necessary. Use it only if they force the question. Then at the bottom of the final page, after his signature turn over the wedding photograph you brought with you, I wrote something on the back that I never had the courage to say while I was alive and breathing the same air as you. She went upstairs and found the photograph in her bag. She turned it over. The handwriting on the back was pencil slightly faded, the kind of fading that happens over years rather than months. He had written it long ago and left it there face down, waiting for a moment that might never have come. The happiest moment of my life was not our wedding day. It was the morning after, when I woke before you and watched you stand at the bedroom window looking out at the yard. You did not know I was awake. You were just standing there, in the early light, not performing anything for anyone, simply existing in the morning. And I thought, there it is. That is the person I want to look at for the rest of my life. I only wish I had said it out loud and sooner and more often, and in 100 other moments when I felt it and said nothing instead. Eleanor sat on the floor of the upstairs bedroom and held the photograph and understood finally the full geometry of what had been given to her and what had been withheld and why, and what the difference between those two things had cost both of them. The next morning, Ruth came with coffee and fresh bread and sat with Eleanor on the stone step of the front entry in the April light. Over the following days, she told Eleanor about Walter in Millhaven, the church roof he had funded without
It's
allowing a
so
plaque,
lovely out
the
here.
scholarship that
It
had sent
really
a
is
young
so
man named
peaceful,
Kyle Marsh to
just
college,
like old
as the
times.
first in his family to earn a degree, the 5,000 books he had bought for the library when the town budget collapsed, the chess games with Harold Finch at the general store every month, the fence he had repaired for a widow at the end of the road after a winter storm. Small things, consistent things, the accumulation of a man who came to a town once a month for 40 years and chose each time to be useful rather than merely present. Then Ruth brought out a small notebook she had been keeping behind the store counter. A plain green spiral notebook with Walter's name written on the cover in Ruth's handwriting. Inside, in Walter's script, was a list. It was titled simply Things to Do with Ellie, and it had been added to over the years in different inks, the earliest entries faded with age. Walk the East Trail at sunrise. Have dinner at Ruth's with a good red wine. Show her where the deer come to drink at dusk in the clearing past the second oak. Drive to the covered bridge on Route 9 in October, when the maples turn. Plant the white climbing rose on the north wall together. None of the entries had been crossed out, not one. Eleanor held the notebook in both hands and understood what she was looking at, the private record of a man who had spent 40 years intending to bring her here and had never found the way, who had kept adding to a list of things he wanted to share with her, while the list grew longer and the years grew shorter and the courage he needed remained just out of reach. It was the saddest and most loving document she had ever held. She sat with it for a long time before she gave it back to Ruth, and Ruth put it back behind the counter without a word, because some things do not require commentary. The call from Whitfield came 4 days after she arrived. Conrad had retained counsel and was moving to challenge the ownership of the Stonewood Ridge property on the grounds of undue influence and lack of independent legal representation at the time of the original gift transfer in 1984. It was, Whitfield told her, a legally weak argument. Eleanor had been a competent adult with no impairment, and the gift had been structured with enough separation from the marital estate that the undue influence theory would struggle to find purchase. But Conrad's attorney was known for his willingness to extend litigation beyond its rational endpoint, and the strategy Whitfield suspected was not to win in court, but to impose cost and attrition on Eleanor until settlement became preferable to continued fighting. "He is counting on the fact that you are 68 years old and alone," Whitfield said, "and that a 3-year legal battle sounds like the rest of your life." Eleanor was standing at the kitchen window of the Stonewood Ridge house, looking out at the wild garden in the April light. "Give me a week," she said. She spent the next 4 days in the small study under the stairs, reading every document in the filing cabinets with the systematic attention she had learned during her 2 years of pre-law at UMass Boston. The years before her mother's illness had changed the direction of her life. She was thorough. She did not allow herself to rush. The folder for Conrad was thick. A real estate transaction from 2019 in Newton, Conrad had represented the buyer while simultaneously receiving an undisclosed commission from the seller, a clear violation of the Massachusetts rules of professional conduct governing conflicts of interest. The documentation was thorough. Email correspondence, financial records, a timeline assembled with the precision of a man preparing a case. It was the kind of file that presented to the Board of Bar Overseers would at minimum result in a formal proceeding and at maximum end a career. Diana's folder contained financial affidavits from her second divorce in 2014 that conflicted materially with separately documented asset records. Brett's folder was thinner but not empty, a chain of internal communications from 2019 in which Brett had expressed private discomfort with Conrad's plan to pressure Walter into revising the estate distribution, followed by his agreement to participate in the pressure campaign anyway. And one email Brett had sent to Diana. "I'm not comfortable with this, but fine. Not criminal, but revealing." Eleanor read everything, closed the cabinets, and sat in Walter's chair for a while. Then she called Whitfield. "I am ready now." Conrad's SUV appeared at the end of Stonewood Ridge on a Tuesday morning in early May, moving slowly over the unpaved road with the careful reluctance of a vehicle that was built for different terrain and knew it. Eleanor watched it from the upstairs window, tracking its progress through the oaks, and felt something settle in her chest that was not quite calm and not quite readiness, but the specific state that exists between them, the physiological acknowledgement that the thing you have been preparing for is finally arriving. She came downstairs before they knocked. She had made coffee for herself because she wanted something warm in her hands that she had chosen, and she stood in the front room among Walter's photographs of her and waited. When the knock came, she crossed to the door and opened it and looked at all three of them standing on the stone step in the May morning light. And she saw the moment when Conrad registered the house's interior behind her and understood that it was not what he had expected. The quality of the furniture, the condition of the floors, the photographs, dozens of them visible from the doorway. Eleanor's face repeated across 40 years in frames that someone had selected with care. Conrad's expression did not change, but something in his eyes recalibrated quickly. A man revising an estimate upward with controlled displeasure. Diana was wearing the same calibrated sympathy she had worn at the will reading. Brett was standing slightly behind and to the left of his older siblings, and Eleanor noticed that he was not looking at her or at the house, but at the clearing beyond the trees, the wild garden, the open space of the place. His hands were in his coat pockets. He looked, for the first time in Eleanor's memory of him, like a man who was somewhere he had not entirely been dragged. She brought them to the study. She sat behind the desk. They arranged themselves in the three chairs she had positioned in front of it, and the geometry of the seating communicated something that none of them acknowledged, but all of them registered. Conrad presented his position with professional fluency. The property had been transferred under circumstances that, in his view, raised legitimate questions about independent representation and the voluntariness of the transaction. The value of the asset was substantial enough to warrant judicial review. He was not. He was careful to say challenging Eleanor's character or Walter's affection for her. He was simply ensuring that the estate had been administered in accordance with the law's requirements for fairness to all parties. Eleanor listened to all of it without moving, without expression, with the particular quality of attention that communicates not agreement, but comprehensive reception. When he finished, she put the folder on the desk and opened it. "Conrad," she said, "I am going to tell you what is in here before I read from it, because I want you to understand that I am not doing this to damage you. Your father did not do it to damage you. He kept these records because he understood the difference between information that is gathered ethically and information that is deployed unethically, and for 50 years he maintained that distinction. I have inherited both the information and the obligation to maintain the distinction, unless the circumstances make it necessary to set the distinction aside. She turned to the first tab section and read the outline of the 2019 Newton transaction clearly, not with the rapid delivery of someone trying to overwhelm, but with the measured pace of someone who wants every word to land individually. The commission structure, the undisclosed dual representation, the specific provision of the Massachusetts Rules of Professional Conduct that the arrangement had violated. Conrad's name throughout associated with each element traceable through documentation that Walter had assembled from sources that were individually unremarkable but collectively complete. The room was quiet enough that she could hear the forest outside. Diana opened her mouth. Eleanor turned to look at her with an evenness that was not unkind and not deferential, and Diana closed her mouth. "I'm not finished," Eleanor said, and there was no heat in it, and somehow the absence of heat made it more final than anger would have. She summarized Diana's financial affidavits from the 2014 divorce proceeding and the documented discrepancy between those affidavits and the asset records Walter had independently sourced. She was brief. She did not editorialize. She closed that tab and moved to Brett's section and paused, and in the pause, she looked at him directly for the first time since they had sat down. Brett was looking at his hands. She read the outline of the 2019 communications, his private reservations, his eventual agreement to go along his email to Diana, and then she closed the folder. "I want to be precise about what I am and am not doing right now," she said. "I am not threatening to release this material. I'm not demanding anything in exchange for not releasing it. I'm showing you what exists so that you can make an informed decision about how you want to proceed. Your father collected this information because he believed in being prepared. I am choosing to use it because you have given me no alternative. If you withdraw the legal challenge and leave me in peace in this house, none of this goes anywhere. If you force a 3-year legal proceeding designed to exhaust a 68-year-old woman into surrender, then I will send the relevant files to the relevant authorities and let the process work the way your father always said it was designed to work." Conrad's color had shifted during the reading of his section and had not fully returned. He was a man accustomed to occupying the position of the person with the most information in any given room, and the discovery that he was not in that position here had produced in him a stillness that Eleanor recognized as the stillness of someone recalculating from first principles. The silence extended long enough to become its own kind of answer. Then Brett stood up. He walked to the window that looked out over the clearing and stood with his back to the room for a moment. When he turned, he was not looking at Conrad or Diana. He was looking at the photographs on the walls. Eleanor's face in its many versions across its 40 years, and his expression was something she had not seen on him before. Unmanaged, unaligned with either of his siblings, simply and quietly his own. Conrad, his voice was low and without drama. "Drop it." Conrad's head turned with the controlled precision of a man who has heard something genuinely surprising and is deciding how to respond to it. Brett was still looking at the photographs. "She has everything she needs to end your career. Dad left her this house. He left it to her on purpose for reasons that are now obvious to anyone who looks at this room for 30 seconds. We got the money and the house in Chestnut Hill, and 40 years of him choosing to keep peace with us instead of standing up for her. We got more than enough." He turned back to the window. "Drop it." The silence that followed had a different quality than the one before. Diana looked at Conrad with the specific expression of a woman checking whether the ground has shifted sufficiently to require a change in position. Conrad looked at the folder on Eleanor's desk, and then at the wall of photographs, and then at his own hands briefly in a gesture that was almost involuntary. The gesture of a man taking stock of something he would not acknowledge taking stock of. He stood. He straightened his jacket. He did not look at Eleanor when he spoke. "We will revisit our legal position." It was the language of a man withdrawing without the word retreat, and Eleanor understood it for exactly what it was. "I know you will," she said, and her voice carried the patience of someone who has already seen the end of this and is simply waiting for the others to arrive there too. They left in the order they had arrived. Conrad first, then Diana, then Brett, who paused in the doorway and turned back. He looked at Eleanor across the room, across the desk, across the 40 years of her life displayed on the walls around her. And what was in his face was not an apology exactly. It was too complicated and too insufficient for that. But it was genuine, which was something she had not received from him before. "He really did love you," Brett said. "I saw it. I just did not do anything about it." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "I know," she said. "Both parts." He nodded and went out, and she heard the SUV doors close and the engine turn over, and the sound of it moving back down the unpaved road through the oaks growing quieter until the forest absorbed it entirely. She sat at Walter's desk for a while after they had gone, not thinking about anything specific, letting the room be quiet around her. Through the study's single narrow window, she could see the edge of the clearing, the light coming through the trees at the angle it always came through, at this time of day falling across the wild garden, in a way that made even the untended growth look intentional. She thought about what it cost a man to watch the people he loved manage their worst impulses and say nothing year after year to keep the surface intact. She thought about what it cost a woman to accommodate that silence for 40 years because she had trusted that it meant something other than what it appeared to mean. And she thought that perhaps the truest thing about any long marriage is that both people are always paying the cost of the other person's limits, and that the question is only whether, at the end, the accounting balances in some way that makes the payment feel like it was worth the price. She decided, sitting in Walter's chair in the May light of the house he had built for her, that for her it had. Not easily, not without cost, but finally and sufficiently. Whitfield called 8 days later. Conrad's attorneys had filed a formal withdrawal. The legal challenge was closed. The deed to 12 Stonewood Ridge was Eleanor's without encumbrance, as it had always legally been, as Walter had always intended it to be. Whitfield's voice on the phone carried a quality she recognized as warmth, restrained by professionalism, which was, she had always thought, the most reliable kind. "It is done," he said. "It is entirely yours." She thanked him and went out to the garden. She had been working on it in the mornings in the weeks since she arrived, spending an hour or two each day with the beds along the southern side of the clearing. The roses were extraordinary. They had been left alone long enough to develop the kind of structural depth that most cultivated roses never achieve, their root systems complex and deep. Their canes heavy with what would in another 6 weeks be a bloom season of serious consequence. She had found varieties she had not seen in years, things that had largely disappeared from commercial catalogs, things that someone had selected with specific and educated care. She thought about Walter choosing those plants, building a garden that would be appropriate for the woman he expected to eventually live here, and felt, as she often felt now about Walter, the particular mixture of gratitude and grief and frustration that had become the characteristic texture of her relationship with his memory. In June, she found the second envelope. She had been reorganizing the bottom drawer of the third filing cabinet, creating space for her own documents. The practical accumulation of a woman establishing a new life when her hand found it at the very back, flat against the panel, easy to miss on a first or second pass. Her name in Walter's handwriting. "Open when you are ready for what comes next." She carried it to the desk and sat down and opened it. The deed was for 20 acres on the eastern edge of Millhaven, adjacent to a conservation parcel, including a small barn and a 2-room cottage that the attached survey described as structurally sound and recently inspected. Both parcels were in her name, fully paid. The accompanying trust documents established a fund of $500,000 designated for any purpose Eleanor Anna Hartwell chooses to pursue in furtherance of her own interests, well-being, or charitable intentions without restriction or condition. The note was half a page, his handwriting. The same pencil he had used on the back of the wedding photograph. "You have spent 40 years living inside the shape of my life. Every room in this house, every choice I could not make openly. Every month I drove to Millhaven and sat in the study and thought about what I should have been brave enough to say. All of it has been pointing toward this. The 20 acres and the cottage are yours to use however you choose. Build something, create something, transform something. You have spent your whole adult life making space for other people. It is time to make space for yourself. I have loved you completely and inadequately, which I suspect is the way most people love, and I am sorry for the inadequate parts. And I am grateful beyond language for the fact that you were there for the complete parts. Whatever you build next, build it for yourself. You have earned the right to want things. Eleanor read the letter twice and set it down and looked out the study window at the clearing in the June light. The roses were at their peak, the bloom season having arrived exactly when she had estimated it would, in the slow cumulative way that gardens reward attention, and the clearing was dense with color. The pinks and creams and deep reds of varieties that had been waiting through years of minimal tending for someone to look at them properly again. She knew looking at it what she wanted to do. The idea had been forming since April, since her first conversations with Ruth, since she had begun to understand what Millhaven was, and who lived there, and what the place could hold. She had been turning it over in her mind the way you turn over a decision that is already made but not yet acknowledged, testing its edges, checking its weight. She had not wanted to name it until she was sure it was not wishful thinking. Now she was sure. She was going to build a retreat center. Not a spa, not a wellness facility, not anything that required a brochure with a particular kind of typography. A place simple and real and carefully maintained where women who had spent their lives in the service of other people's needs could come and be somewhere without an obligation attached to the being there. Widows, women leaving difficult situations, women in the particular limbo of having outlived the roles that had defined them and not yet found the vocabulary for what came next. The 20 acres had a barn that could be converted. The cottage could house a resident manager. The main house on Stonewood Ridge had 3 bedrooms that were currently unused. The $500,000 in the trust fund, managed carefully, was sufficient to build the infrastructure and sustain operations through the first several years. She told Ruth first over coffee in the kitchen on a Thursday morning in late June, and Ruth listened without interrupting, which Eleanor had come to understand was Ruth's way of paying serious attention. When Eleanor finished, Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then I have been waiting for someone to do exactly that for about 15 years. I just did not know it would be you. She told Whitfield, who provided his services pro bono for the non-profit incorporation and the zoning applications his idea offered before she could ask, with the briskness of a man settling a debt he had been carrying for a while. Sarah Graves, the town librarian, who had been managing Millhaven's collection on a budget that barely covered new acquisitions, agreed to run the programs 3 days a week in exchange for a salary that was modest by Boston standards and substantial by the standards of what the town had previously been able to offer anyone. The name came quickly and without deliberation, the way names come when they are simply true. Hartwell House. Not a monument to Walter, not a memorial to what had been lost. A name that meant this is what the Hartwell story becomes when it is finally told by the person who lived it most completely. She registered it on a Tuesday morning sitting at Walter's desk with her laptop and a cup of coffee, and felt completing the form the particular satisfaction of a thing done that cannot be undone, the satisfaction of having planted something that will outlast the planting. Brett came to Millhaven in July alone in a pickup truck that was not the vehicle of a man performing his social position. He stood at the gate and asked permission before coming in, which was something Conrad would not have thought to do, and Eleanor opened the gate and brought him inside and made coffee. He sat at the kitchen table and looked at his hands for a while before he said what he had come to say, that he had known what was being done and had done nothing, and that he understood this was insufficient, but needed to say it in a place that was hers, rather than in a neutral location that belonged to neither of them. He said that Walter had left him an actual possibility inside the trust structure, a chance to manage something, build something, and that he was trying to decide if he was capable of taking it seriously. He was 56 years old and had spent 56 years being the smallest version of himself that would keep the peace in whatever room he was in. And he was not certain he knew how to do anything else, but he was considering the attempt. Eleanor listened to all of this and then said, "Your father did not build traps for you, Brett. He built tests. The difference is that a trap is designed to catch you. A test is designed to show you what you are made of. Those are only the same thing if you decide to treat them that way." Brett looked up from his hands. The expression on his face was the expression of a man receiving information that he will need considerable time to process, but that he recognizes immediately and without defense as true. He left an hour later, and she did not know if he would come back. And she found that she was genuinely uncertain how she wanted that uncertainty to resolve, which was itself a kind of freedom. She was no longer required to want particular things about the Hartwell children. She could hold the question loosely, with the same looseness she was learning to bring to other things that were no longer her obligation to manage. As for Conrad and Diana, the machinery Walter had constructed continued its work without any intervention from Eleanor. The Chestnut Hill house had proven precisely as difficult to sell as Walter had engineered it to be. The historic preservation easements, a 200-page document requiring any prospective buyer to maintain the property's exterior characteristics and submit to periodic reviews by a historical commission, had discouraged 3 serious offers and would likely discourage more. The substantial mortgage Walter had taken out against the property 2 years before his death, the terms of which the siblings had discovered only when the estate was formally settled, meant that the net proceeds of any eventual sale would be considerably less than the appraised value that had seemed so promising at the will reading. Conrad's trust, the $3.1 million in investment accounts he had been counting on as his primary inheritance, was locked behind annual distributions capped at $100,000, each release contingent on a certification of ethical conduct reviewed by a retired federal judge, who had in 2015 formally cautioned Conrad about a conflict of interest in a real estate matter and extended what he had explicitly called a final professional courtesy. Conrad was required to appear before this man each year and demonstrate with documented evidence that he had earned the next installment. Diana's access to her trust was conditioned on documentation of stable family relationships, a standard that her estrangement from 2 of her 3 adult children made essentially impossible to satisfy without years of genuine repair work that Diana had shown no inclination to undertake. The siblings had received exactly what they had demanded. The reckoning was arriving on the schedule Walter had set as quietly and as precisely as everything else he had built. The first resident arrived at Hartwell House in late August. Dorothy Simmons, 73, from Worcester, who had been widowed in June and whose adult children had, with the specific efficiency of people who cannot tolerate uncertainty, been moving her toward a managed care facility she had not agreed to enter. A social worker in Worcester had heard about Hartwell House through the Second Chapter Women's Network, a Boston-based organization Eleanor had contacted in July, and had called Eleanor on a Wednesday afternoon to ask if there was space. Eleanor had said yes immediately and had driven to Worcester on Friday morning to pick Dorothy up herself in the Honda Civic, because the alternative was waiting for arrangements to be made by people who were already treating Dorothy as a problem to be administered rather than a person to be considered. Dorothy had been quiet for most of the drive back to Millhaven, watching the landscape change from urban to rural, with the expression of someone who had stopped expecting to be surprised by anything, and was being surprised anyway. When Eleanor turned onto the unpaved road through the oaks, and the house came into view in the afternoon light, Dorothy made a sound that was not quite a word. A small involuntary intake of breath, the sound a person makes when they encounter something they did not know they needed. "How long can I stay?" Dorothy asked. "As long as you need," Eleanor said, and meant it without qualification. By October, Hartwell House had 3 residents and a waiting list. Ruth had begun attending the Thursday evening community gatherings that Eleanor had started, partly because she enjoyed them, and partly because she was, as Eleanor had discovered, a woman with extensive reserves of practical wisdom that she had been deploying quietly in Millhaven's favor for years, and was pleased to have a formal occasion for. Thomas Graves had agreed to manage the grounds in exchange for a formal contract that included a salary and health insurance, which he accepted with the expression of a man who has been underpaid for his skills for a long time and has decided to stop allowing it. Sarah Graves had redesigned the programming calendar twice already, based on what she was learning from the residents about what they actually needed versus what had been assumed they would need. And the redesigns were better each time, which was the sign of someone approaching the work with genuine rather than performed attention. The roses finished their second bloom in the third week of October, and Eleanor cut the last of them, a deep cream climber that had put out one final flush against the October cold, defiant and beautiful, and clearly indifferent to the season's objections, and put them in a jar on the kitchen windowsill, where she could see them from the table. She was sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee on a Friday morning in late October, when she understood that she was not, and had not been for some time, waiting for anything. The held breath that had been her interior weather since March had resolved itself into something else, something she had not experienced in long enough, that it took her a while to identify it correctly. It was not happiness exactly, though happiness was present in it. It was not peace exactly, though peace was there too. It was the specific quality of a person who has arrived somewhere after a very long journey, and recognized the arrival not with fanfare, but with the quiet cellular certainty of a body that has finally stopped bracing for the next displacement. She was 68 years old. She was sitting in the kitchen of a house that was hers in every way a house can be hers. Outside the window, the oaks were at their full October color, the clearing around the house dense with gold and amber, and the dark red of late-season maples at the forest's edge. Inside the house, Dorothy Simmons was learning with assistance from Sarah to video call her younger daughter in Portland, the one who had called Eleanor 3 weeks ago to say she had not known about Hartwell House until a friend forwarded the link, and she wanted to say thank you, and that she thought her mother sounded more like herself than she had in years. Eleanor thought about Walter as she did most mornings, with the complexity that his memory now reliably produced, the man who had failed her in the visible ways and loved her in the invisible ones, who had built her a fortress and called it a neglected inheritance, who had spent 40 years being the smaller version of himself in Boston and the larger version in Millhaven, and had never managed to reconcile the two until the reconciliation no longer required his presence. She thought about what it means to love someone across the full distance of who they actually are. Not the version you needed them to be, not the version they presented, but the whole complicated architecture of a person who is always doing their imperfect best with the materials their life has given them. She thought it might be the hardest thing a person can do, and she thought she had done it. And she thought Walter, in his oblique and patient and ultimately sufficient way, had done it for her too. The coffee was warm in her hands. The light through the kitchen window was the particular amber of late October. In New England, the kind of light that makes everything it touches look like it has already been missed and is being seen again for the first time. Through the door, she could hear Dorothy's voice, tentative at first, and then breaking into genuine laughter at something on the screen, the laughter of a woman rediscovering that she is still capable of being delighted. Eleanor Hartwell, 68 years old, had arrived, not at an ending, not at the diminished accommodation of a life reduced by loss, at something that had been waiting for her all along, in a stone house at the end of an unpaved road in a town nobody had heard of, behind a door that opened with a key that someone had painted to look broken so that only the right person would think to use it. She set down her coffee cup and went outside to check on her roses.